The quiet of a wealthy Saturday morning in Cedar Hollow broke around a single, unbelievable image. A young police officer was walking a calm, middle-aged black man across his own front lawn in handcuffs, steering him toward a patrol car parked crooked in the driveway. The man wore a faded gray t-shirt, old jeans, and grass-stained sneakers, and he did not struggle or shout. He kept his eyes on his own open garage, still stacked with half-unpacked moving boxes, while above his front door, a small doorbell camera blinked a steady red, recording every second. Two neighbors had drifted out onto their porches to watch. Officer Cody Hart felt the warm glow of a good arrest, certain he had just caught a burglar casing the finest houses on the block. What Hart did not know, what he had refused 3 separate times to check, was that the man he was cuffing had moved into that house the day before, that the leather folder sitting on the passenger seat of the car Hart assumed was stolen held a signed commission naming that man the new chief of police, and that on Monday morning, the quiet man in handcuffs would be Officer Cody Hart's boss. Before we find out who the man in the handcuffs really was, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's dive back into the story. To understand how a Saturday car wash turned into the end of a young officer's career, you have to rewind about 40 minutes to the moment Raymond Dixon carried the last box out of the moving truck. Raymond Dixon was 52 years old, a broad, unhurried man with close-cropped gray hair and the steady, watchful calm of someone who had spent his whole adult life in rooms where the temperature could change in a heartbeat. He had closed on the house in Cedar Hollow 8 days earlier and spent Friday moving in. Now it was Saturday, and the place was still a maze of cardboard, packing paper, and furniture in the wrong spots. He had traded his suits for a faded gray t-shirt gone soft with age, a pair of old jeans, and sneakers he only wore for yard work and painting. Because on Monday morning, Raymond Dixon was going to put on a pressed uniform for the first time in a long time, walk into police headquarters, and be sworn in as the new chief of police for the entire city. He had earned it the slow way. 25 years, starting as a patrol officer working the roughest beats in the city, riding a one-man car on night shifts, answering the calls nobody wanted. He had made detective, then sergeant, then lieutenant, then captain, and finally deputy chief in a neighboring county, building a reputation as a fair, exacting, unshakably honest cop who believed the badge was a public trust and not a personal weapon. When the city's mayor and council came looking for someone to reform a department bruised by years of complaints, they came to him. He had said yes because he believed he could fix it. He had no idea his first real lesson in exactly what needed fixing would arrive before he ever set foot in the building. That was the other thing sitting in Raymond's life that Saturday morning, and it was sitting quite literally on the passenger seat of his car. A thick leather folder. Inside it was his official commission, the signed and sealed document naming him Chief, along with a small box holding the chief's badge he would pin on Monday. And underneath those, a stack of printouts he had spent Friday night reading at his new kitchen table, a sampling of the department's open use of force and profiling complaints, the homework he had assigned himself, so he would walk in on day one, already knowing where the problems were. He had read dozens of them, and one name had come up more than once, attached to stop after stop of young black men in nice neighborhoods who turned out to have done nothing at all. The name was Officer Cody Hart. Raymond didn't know Hart's face. He had never met the man. He only knew the name from a page. He set the leather folder on the passenger seat, closed the car door, and, wanting a break from the boxes, decided to do the most ordinary thing in the world. He picked up a bucket, a sponge, and the garden hose, and he started washing his car in his own driveway in the morning sun. He had been at it about 10 minutes when a patrol cruiser slowed to a crawl at the end of his street. Officer Cody Hart was 30 years old, 4 years on the job, and he considered Cedar Hollow his personal territory. It was the wealthiest patrol zone in the city. Big lots, old trees, 3-car garages, and residents who waved at him and called the watch commander to say what a fine young officer he was. Hart liked it that way. He had built a whole identity around the idea that he was the thing standing between these beautiful houses, and the people he privately believed did not belong near them. The shifts were slow, and Hart filled the boredom by deciding who fit and who didn't. He had learned every car in the neighborhood, or thought he had. So, when he rolled around the corner onto Raymond Dixon Street and saw a large black man in an old t-shirt and beat-up sneakers standing in the driveway of one of the nicest houses on the block, a hose in his hand, something in Hart lit up. He did not think, that must be a new resident washing his car. He did not think, I don't recognize him. I should say a friendly hello and find out. In the half-second it took his eyes to land on Raymond, Hart had already written the whole story, and it was a story about a threat, a guy who didn't fit, a guy in cheap clothes at an expensive house, probably casing it. Maybe the homeowners were out of town. Maybe that car in the driveway was already stolen. Every piece of the picture Hart assembled in that instant was built from the man's clothes and the color of his skin, and not one piece of it was built from a single fact. Hart slowed the cruiser to a crawl, pretending to look at his mobile terminal while he studied Raymond in his side vision. Standard procedure, if he actually suspected a crime, would have been simple. Run the plate on the car, call it in, ask dispatch whether there was any report of a burglary in the area, maybe roll down the window and have a normal conversation. Hart did none of those things. He didn't run the plate. He didn't ask dispatch anything. He just watched the man he had already convicted, and then he made his move. He swung the heavy Ford Explorer into Raymond's driveway at an aggressive angle, nosing it in behind Raymond's car to block it from pulling out, cutting off the escape route of a man who was doing nothing but rinsing soap off a fender. He threw it into park, keyed his radio to mark himself out on a suspicious person, and stepped out into the morning sun with his hand already resting on his duty belt, inches from his holster. "Hey!" Hart called out, his voice pitched hard and flat. "Step away from the vehicle. Keep your hands where I can see them." Raymond straightened slowly and turned off the hose. He had heard that tone 10,000 times in 25 years from the other side. He recognized everything about it, the planted feet, the hand near the weapon, the eyes locked on his chest instead of his face. He set the hose down on the driveway with deliberate, visible calm and kept his hands loose and open at his sides. "Morning, officer," Raymond said, his voice a low, even baritone, carrying no fear and no heat. "There a problem?" "Whose car is this?" Hart demanded, ignoring the greeting, taking a step closer. "It's mine," Raymond said. "So is the house. I moved in yesterday. Name's Raymond Dixon." He tipped his head toward the open garage and its wall of moving boxes. "It's still got about 100 boxes to prove it." Hart's eyes flicked to the garage, then snapped back to Raymond, and whatever he saw did not fit the story he'd already committed to, so he simply discarded it. "I'm going to need to see some ID," Hart said. "Right now." "Happy to," Raymond replied, unbothered. "My wallet's inside on the kitchen counter. My documents for the house are in a folder in the car, right there on the passenger seat. You tell me which one you'd rather I get, and I'll move nice and slow while I do it." It was the most reasonable answer a person could possibly give, and it was the exact moment Officer Cody Hart decided to make everything worse. Now, here is what Officer Hart could not have known as he stood in that driveway, and what the man in front of him had not yet said, because saying it would have felt like pulling rank over a car wash. And Raymond Dixon had spent his whole career refusing to be that man. The person Hart had just blocked into his own driveway, the person he had already decided was a burglar, was going to be sworn in on Monday morning as the chief of police of the entire city. He was going to be the highest-ranking officer in the department. He was going to be the final signature on every promotion, every commendation, and every termination. He was, in less than 48 hours, going to be Cody Hart's boss's boss's boss. And it was worse than that, in a way that turned the whole scene into something almost unbearable to watch. Because the leather folder sitting right there on the passenger seat of the stolen car, The folder Raymond had offered to retrieve did not just contain his commission and his new chief's badge. Underneath them sat a stack of papers Raymond had read at his kitchen table the night before, open complaints from the department he was about to lead. Stop after stop of young black men pulled over and patted down and questioned in nice neighborhoods for the crime of existing in them. And one name that had surfaced on those pages more than any other, Officer Cody Hart. Raymond had read that name in his own kitchen 12 hours earlier and thought, I am going to have to deal with that one. He simply hadn't expected that one to come screaming into his driveway on a Saturday and hand him the entire case, on video, before he'd even started the job. That is the terrible, quiet gravity of what you're watching. The man doing the profiling had, by pure blind luck, chosen to profile the one person on Earth with the most direct power over his career. And he was about to do the single most incriminating thing he could possibly do, with his own body camera running and a doorbell camera watching from the porch. If you've ever watched someone dig themselves a hole this deep and just kept digging, do me a favor right now. Hit that like button and subscribe, because the moment this officer finds out who he's talking to is the moment you're going to want to see, and it is coming. Raymond, for his part, gave the young officer every possible off-ramp. He did not say, I'm the incoming chief. He did not say, I've read your file. He didn't pull rank or raise his voice or reach for his phone to start recording and embarrass him. He stood in his own driveway in a soap-flecked t-shirt and offered calmly and repeatedly to simply show the man his identification. He did it because 25 years had taught him that the goal in a moment like this is never to win the argument on the pavement. The goal is to get home. And Raymond Dixon was standing in front of his own home, giving a young man in a uniform chance after chance to be better than the worst version of himself. Cody Hart took none of them. I don't care where your wallet is, Hart snapped. You don't reach for anything. You keep your hands out and you tell me the truth. This your house? Because I know this neighborhood and I've never seen you before in my life. You've never seen me because I moved in yesterday, Raymond said, his patience holding like a stone wall. That's generally how new neighbors work, officer. There was a moving truck in this driveway from 8 in the morning until dark. Ask any of these folks watching us right now. Because they were watching now. Across the street, a retired school teacher named Susan Alvarez had come out onto her porch, drawn by the crooked patrol car and the raised voice, and she had quietly lifted her phone and begun to record. And above Raymond's own front door, the little doorbell camera he'd installed on Friday afternoon sat streaming the entire encounter to his phone and to the cloud, its red light a small, steady witness. Then, the screen door of the house next door banged open, and a teenager came halfway down his own front steps and stopped cold. His name was Andre Fisher. He was 17, tall and thin, and he had lived next to Raymond's new house his whole life. He had been getting the mail when he heard the cop, and the moment he saw the officer's face, his stomach dropped because he recognized him. 2 months ago, walking home from a friend's house after dark in his own neighborhood, Andre had been stopped by this exact officer, Hart, made to empty his pockets on the hood of a cruiser and explain himself for 20 minutes for absolutely nothing before being let go without so much as an apology. Andre had never filed a complaint. He'd been too scared, and he hadn't thought anyone would believe him over a cop. Now he stood frozen on his steps, watching the same officer do the same thing to the quiet man who had waved hello to him just yesterday while unloading boxes. "He does live there," Andre called out, his voice shaking but carrying. "Sir, officer, he moved in yesterday. I watched the truck. He's my neighbor. That's his house." Hart didn't even turn his head. "Stay out of this and go back inside," he barked at the boy, and to Hart, the teenager's words weren't information. They were noise. 2 black faces telling him the same story only confirmed the story he'd already built in his head. That something was off here, that these people stuck together, that he was the only thing standing between order and chaos on this pretty street. That is what profiling actually is. It is not a single ugly thought. It is a machine that turns every new fact, no matter how innocent, into more evidence for a conclusion it reached before any facts arrived. Raymond had spent a career studying that machine. He was now standing in his own driveway, watching it run in real time, pointed directly at him. And Andre Fisher, 17 years old and still half afraid, did the bravest thing he'd done in his life. He didn't go inside. He took out his own phone with his hands trembling, and he started to record too, because some deep instinct told him that this time there needed to be proof. "Sir?" Raymond said to Hart, his voice dropping into something quieter and more deliberate, the voice of a man making a record for the cameras he knew were rolling. "I have told you this is my home. I have offered you my identification 3 times. That young man just confirmed I'm his neighbor. You have no reasonable suspicion of any crime. I'd like you to move your vehicle so we can both get on with our Saturday." Hart's jaw tightened. Being told the law correctly by the man he'd decided was a criminal was the one thing his ego could not absorb. He reached for his handcuffs. "Turn around," Hart ordered, unclipping the cuffs from his belt. "Hands behind your back. You're being detained." "On what grounds?" Raymond asked, not moving yet, keeping his hands visible. "Suspicion of burglary and failure to identify," Hart said. "Turn around, now." Raymond looked at him for one long second. He could have said the words that would have ended it instantly. He could have told Hart exactly who he was. But he had watched too many encounters go sideways the moment a cop felt challenged, and he made a cold, professional calculation. A man who was already this committed to being wrong was not going to be talked down, and the safest thing, the thing most likely to end with everyone alive and the truth on tape, was to comply now and win later on the record. So Raymond Dixon, the incoming chief of police, turned around in his own driveway and put his hands behind his back. Hart snapped the cuffs on, ratcheting them a notch tighter than he needed to, the steel biting into Raymond's wrists. He gripped the older man by the arm and pushed him a step toward the cruiser, then paused, his eyes landing on the car in the driveway. The car Raymond had said held his documents. "Let's just see about this car," Hart muttered. He pulled open the passenger door without permission, leaned in, and there on the seat was exactly what Raymond had described, a thick leather folder. Hart picked it up, and here, again, was the moment the whole thing could have ended. All he had to do was open it. He didn't. He gave it a dismissive shake, decided a burglar's folder wasn't worth his time, and tossed it carelessly onto the hood of the car, where it slid and came to rest half open against the windshield wipers. He never saw the gold edge of the badge box inside. He never saw the word commission. He never saw his own name printed on the complaint sheets underneath. He just left it sitting there in the sun and turned back to his prisoner. "You are under arrest," Hart announced, loudly and clearly, projecting the words toward the camera on his own chest. "For burglary and obstruction. You have the right to remain silent." Behind him, on her porch, Susan Alvarez kept her phone steady and whispered, "Oh my God." On the neighboring steps, Andre Fisher held his own phone up with both shaking hands and did not look away. And above the front door, the little doorbell camera recorded all of it. The cuffs, the folder tossed aside, the false charge announced to the morning air. Raymond didn't resist. He rolled his shoulders to ease the bite of the too tight steel, turned his head slightly toward the body camera on Hart's chest, and began, in that calm, unhurried baritone, to lay down a record that would outlive the young officer's career. "For the camera," Raymond said. "My name is Raymond Dixon. This is my home, which I purchased and moved into this week. I offered this officer my identification 3 separate times. He refused to look at it. A neighbor confirmed my residency. There is documentation proving my identity sitting on the hood of this car, which the officer removed and refused to open. I have not committed any crime. I am being arrested in handcuffs on my own property, and every second of it is being recorded by his camera, by my doorbell, and by 2 witnesses. I want all of it preserved." "Yeah, everybody's got a speech," Hart said, and steered him down the driveway toward the patrol car. If you already know this is about to blow up in this officer's face, hit like and subscribe so more people see how it ends, because it is about to end very fast. Hart opened the rear door of the Explorer, put a hand on Raymond's head, and guided him down into the hard plastic seat of the cage. The door slammed shut, sealing the incoming chief of police inside the back of a patrol car on his own driveway. Then Hart did the thing he should have done 20 minutes and 1 arrest ago. He walked back to his laptop, and he finally ran the license plate on the car in the driveway. The result came back in seconds, and it was not complicated. The car was registered to a Raymond Dixon. The registration address was the address of the house they were parked in front of. There were no wants, no warrants, no stolen vehicle report, nothing. Everything the man in his back seat had told him was, in black and white on the screen, simply true. A reasonable officer would have felt the floor drop out from under him right there and moved immediately to undo his mistake. But Cody Hart had already invested too much of his ego in being right, and the machine in his head did what that machine always does. It reached for a new story. Maybe the guy stole the identity. Maybe he'd worked some scam to get the car and the house in that name. Maybe it was all part of something bigger. Rather than accept the plain fact that he had cuffed an innocent homeowner, Hart decided the matching name was just more evidence of how sophisticated this criminal must be. So instead of releasing Raymond, he keyed his radio and requested a supervisor and a transport unit to his location to take one male into custody for burglary and obstruction. He wanted to hand this off cleanly, get it booked, and let the story become official before anyone could poke a hole in it. Inside the cage, Raymond Dixon sat with his hands cuffed behind his back, his shoulders forced into an unnatural angle, and did not say a word. He wasn't panicking. He had sat in the front seat of a car exactly like this one for years, and he understood every move being made around him better than the man making them. He simply watched through the window the small crowd that had gathered on the quiet street, Susan Alvarez still filming from her porch, an older couple from 3 doors down, Andre Fisher standing at the edge of his lawn with his phone up and his jaw set. And Raymond thought about Monday. He thought about the speech he'd been drafting for the department, the one about rebuilding trust, about the difference between a warrior and a guardian, about how a badge is a promise and not a license. He had worried, writing it, that it might sound like empty words to a room full of veteran cops who had heard it all before. He was not worried anymore. He was going to walk into that room on Monday and be able to say, "This happened to me on my own lawn 2 days before I took this job, and here is the video." No speech he could have written would ever land harder than that. Outside the car, Andre Fisher was quietly doing something else too. Still filming with one hand, he had pulled up a number with the other. He didn't call the police. The police were right there, and that was the problem. He called his mother inside the house and told her in a low, urgent voice to come out and to bring her phone, because the officer who had hassled him 2 months ago was arresting their new neighbor for nothing, and somebody with a grown-up voice needed to be a witness. The street was filling with people now, and a second set of headlights turned onto the block, a supervisor's cruiser rolling toward the house. The man about to step out of it had been on the force for 20 years, and unlike Cody Hart, he had been paying attention to the news. Sergeant Ed Malloy was 45, gray at the temples, 20 years on the job, and constitutionally allergic to drama. He had been 3 blocks away when Hart's request for a supervisor and a transport came over the air, and something in the call, a burglary arrest in Cedar Hollow on a Saturday morning, had made him frown and turn the wheel. Cedar Hollow did not produce burglary arrests on Saturday mornings. It produced noise complaints about landscapers. He parked at the curb, taking in the scene as he climbed out. The crooked patrol car nosed into a driveway, a cuffed man sitting in the back of it, a growing knot of neighbors on their phones, and his young officer standing by the hood looking pleased with himself. Malloy's frown deepened. Every instinct earned over 2 decades told him this was wrong before he understood why. Then he walked close enough to see the face of the man in the back seat through the window, and his stomach dropped straight through the pavement, Because Ed Malloy had been in the briefing room 11 days earlier when the department's command staff had introduced, by photograph and by name, the city's incoming chief of police, the reformer coming over from the next county, the man every sergeant and lieutenant had been told, in no uncertain terms, would be running the entire department starting Monday. Malloy had studied that photograph. He had wondered what the new boss would be like. He was now looking at that exact face, that exact man, folded into the back of a cage car in a soap-stained t-shirt with his hands cuffed behind his back. For a moment, Malloy genuinely could not speak. He looked at the man in the back seat. He looked at Hart, grinning by the hood. He looked back at the man in the back seat, praying he was wrong, knowing he was not. "Hart," Malloy said, and his voice came out strange and tight. "Who do you have in the car?" "Burglary suspect, Sarge," Hart said, still riding his high. "Caught him in the driveway of the Hendricks place. Or, well, he claims it's his place now, but he's got no ID on him, gave me a whole song and dance. Plate comes back to some name that matches what he said, but I figure it's a stolen identity, so I—" "Stop talking," Malloy said. The sharpness of it wiped the grin off Hart's face. "Sarge." Malloy didn't answer him. He walked to the rear door of the Explorer, his mouth dry, and opened it. He crouched down to the level of the man inside, and he made himself ask the question, even though he already knew the answer. "Sir," Malloy said carefully, "can you tell me your name?" The man in the back seat regarded him with a calm, level gaze that Malloy recognized instantly, the unmistakable, bone-deep composure of command. "My name is Raymond Dixon," the man said quietly. "On Monday morning, Sergeant, I'm scheduled to be sworn in as your chief of police, and right now, I'm sitting in the back of this car, in handcuffs, on the driveway of the house I bought last week, because your officer decided a black man washing his own car had to be a criminal." Ed Malloy closed his eyes for one full second. In 20 years, he had been in shootings, pursuits, and riots, and he was not sure any of them had made his blood run as cold as those two sentences did. "Oh no," Hart said behind him, the first crack of real fear entering his voice. No, Sarge. He doesn't have any ID. He's obviously just saying that." "His documents are on the hood of the car, Hart," Malloy said, rising slowly to his feet. "Aren't they? Because he told you they were, and you didn't look." He walked to the hood, where the leather folder still sat half open against the windshield wipers, exactly where Hart had tossed it, and Ed Malloy reached down and opened it the rest of the way. Inside the folder, under the bright Saturday sun, was everything Raymond Dixon had said and more. On top lay an official document on heavy paper, a state and municipal seal embossed at the header, the language formal and unmistakable. A commission appointing Raymond Dixon to the office of Chief of Police, signed by the mayor, dated and sealed. Beneath it, nestled in a small presentation box, sat a gold chief's badge, the rank shield Raymond would pin to his uniform in less than 48 hours, catching the light. And beneath the badge sat a stack of printed complaints. Malloy lifted them, and his eyes moved down the top page, and the last of the color drained out of his face. Because he was looking at the department's own open profiling complaints, internal documents the new chief had clearly been reviewing before taking office, and the name printed across the incident he was staring at, the officer named in stop after stop of young men detained for nothing, was Cody Hart. The man Hart had arrested wasn't just the incoming chief. He was the incoming chief who had spent the previous night reading a file with Hart's name in it, wondering what to do about the officer, when that very officer came screeching into his driveway and did the whole thing again, to him, on camera. Ed Malloy had processed a lot of catastrophes in 20 years. He had never processed one this total. He closed the folder with a care that bordered on reverence, tucked it under his arm, and walked back to the rear of the cruiser without another glance at Hart. "Get out of the way," he said quietly. He reached into the back seat, took his handcuff key, and unlocked the steel from Raymond Dixon's wrists himself, easing the older man's arms forward. Deep red grooves ringed both wrists where the over-tightened cuffs had bitten in. Raymond rolled his shoulders and rubbed one wrist slowly, working the blood back into his hands, and stepped out of the cage onto his own driveway. "Chief Dixon," Malloy said, and his voice was hoarse. "I am, sir. There are no words. I'm Sergeant Ed Malloy. I was in your introduction briefing last week. I am so sorry." "I know who you are, Sergeant," Raymond said. He took the leather folder back from Malloy's hands, and for a moment he simply looked at it. The commission, the badge, the complaint pages, the whole strange weight of the morning gathered in one worn leather cover. Then he looked up, past Malloy, at Cody Hart. Hart had gone the color of paper. The swagger was gone. His hands hung at his sides, and the reality of what he had done was arriving in waves across his face, each one worse than the last. He had cuffed the chief of police, on camera, on the man's own lawn, with his name already sitting in the man's complaint file. "Chief, I swear to God I didn't know," Hart stammered. "You have to understand, from where I was standing, I understand exactly where you were standing, Officer Hart," Raymond said, and though his voice never rose, it landed with the flat, absolute finality of a closing door. "You were standing in my driveway, refusing to look at the truth I offered you 4 separate times, because you had already decided what a man like me could and couldn't be. I know precisely where you were standing. I've been reading about where you stand for the last 2 days. The recognition of his own name, of what must be in that folder, hit Hart's face like a physical blow. Raymond Dixon turned to Malloy, and the register of his voice shifted, no longer a citizen on his lawn, but a chief addressing his department. "Sergeant Malloy, listen carefully, because this is your first order from your incoming chief, and how you handle the next 10 minutes matters," Raymond said. "I want an immediate preservation order placed on Officer Hart's body camera footage and his dash camera footage, effective now. Nothing overwritten, nothing deleted, chain of custody documented. I want the computer log of when he ran my plate and what it returned. I also want the doorbell footage from my own front door. And I want statements from every neighbor standing on this street, including the young man on the lawn there and his mother. Every second of this is recorded from at least 4 directions. I want all of it secured before anyone has a chance to get creative with a report." "Yes, sir," Malloy said, already pulling out his phone. "It's done. I'm flagging it now." "Officer Hart," Raymond continued, turning back to the young man, "you are not going to touch your camera, your report, or your keyboard until Internal Affairs has this. You will surrender your body camera to Sergeant Malloy, and you will sit in your vehicle and say nothing. Do you understand me?" Hart's mouth opened and closed. "Chief, please, I have a family. You'll have every process you're entitled to," Raymond said, "which is exactly 4 more processes than you gave me this morning. Sit down." Hart sat. And then Raymond Dixon did something that told you everything about the kind of chief he intended to be. He did not walk into his house to nurse his wrists and his anger. He walked across the driveway, past the patrol cars, to the edge of his neighbor's lawn, where Andre Fisher still stood with his phone in his trembling hand. "You can put that down now, son," Raymond said gently. "You did the right thing keeping it up. What's your name?" "Andre," the boy managed. "Andre Fisher. I live right there. Sir, that officer, he stopped me too, a couple months ago. Walking home, made me empty my pockets, kept me on his car for 20 minutes. I never told anybody. I didn't think it'd matter." Something moved behind Raymond's eyes, quiet and deep. He had read the file. He may well have read a version of this exact stop, buried in the stack, filed by no one, because a scared teenager didn't think anyone would believe him. "It matters," Raymond said. "It mattered then, and it matters now, and I am sorry no one made you feel like it did. Here's what's going to happen, Andre. On Monday, I start a new job, and part of that job, starting the very first day, is making sure what happened to you and what happened to me on this street this morning stops happening on my watch. But I'm going to need people brave enough to say what they saw. You were brave enough today with a camera. Would you be brave enough to say it on the record?" Andre looked at the calm, cuffed and uncuffed man who was apparently about to run the entire police department, and he stood up a little straighter. "Yes, sir," he said. "I would." "Good man," Raymond said. Behind them, Susan Alvarez lowered her phone at last, her eyes wet. The older couple from down the street were murmuring to each other. Andre's mother had come out onto the lawn and stood with a hand over her mouth. The whole quiet neighborhood had watched a man get arrested for nothing on his own property, and then watched that same man, freed, spend his first free minutes making sure a frightened teenager knew his fear had finally found a witness with the power to do something about it. Raymond Dixon turned and walked back toward his open garage and his 100 unpacked boxes. He had a house to put in order this weekend, and on Monday, he had a department to do the same too. Monday morning came, and Raymond Dixon put on the uniform. He pinned the Gold Chief's badge, the same badge that had sat in a folder on the hood of a car while a young officer decided he was a burglar, to his chest, and he drove to police headquarters, and he was sworn in as chief of police in front of the mayor, the city council, the assembled command staff, and a room full of officers. Word of what had happened on Saturday had already moved through the department the way only that kind of story can. By the time the new chief stepped to the podium, every person in the room knew that one of their own had spent the weekend as the answer to a trivia question no cop ever wants to be. The officer who arrested the incoming chief of police on his own lawn. The room was very, very quiet. Raymond did not open with it. He gave the speech he had written, about the difference between a warrior and a guardian, about the badge as a promise and not a license, about rebuilding the trust of the people they served. And then he set the pages down, and he told them, plainly, what had happened to him on Saturday. He told them about the hose and the t-shirt and the 4 refusals to look at his ID. He told them about the folder tossed on the hood. He told them about the cuffs, tightened 1 notch past necessary, on his own driveway, in front of his new neighbors. "I am not telling you this to humiliate anyone," he said. "I am telling you this because on Saturday I was given, by accident, the clearest possible picture of the exact problem this department hired me to fix. If it can happen to me, a man about to become your chief, standing on property I own, offering my identification again and again, then understand what it means that it happens constantly to people with far less protection than I have, who never get a folder on the hood to save them, and who never get believed. That stops now. Not with a slogan, with accountability every single time, starting with this." You could have heard a pin drop. Somewhere in the building that morning, Officer Cody Hart was not in that room. He had been placed on administrative leave before the sun came up Saturday, his body camera and service weapon already logged into evidence. He had spent the weekend making frantic calls, telling himself the same thing he had told himself in the driveway, that from where he was standing, it had been reasonable, that it would blow over, that the system would protect him the way it always had. But the system that had always protected officers like Cody Hart had just changed management, and the man now running it had personally lived every second of what Hart had done. Here's the thing worth pausing on, and I'd love your take in the comments. How many officers had made a stop exactly like Hart's over the years and had it quietly disappear into a drawer, precisely because the person they stopped didn't happen to be about to become the chief? Hart's real mistake wasn't bad luck. It was doing on camera to the one man who could no longer let it disappear, the same thing he had done a dozen times to people who could. If you're still with me, drop a like and subscribe, because the accounting that followed was swift. The internal affairs investigation did not take long, because there was almost nothing left to investigate. The evidence didn't have to be gathered so much as collected off the ground where it was lying. There was Hart's own body camera footage, which showed Raymond calm and cooperative from the first word, offering his identification 3 separate times, being cuffed without ever resisting, and stating clearly for the record who he was and where his documents could be found. There was the doorbell camera from Raymond's own front door, capturing the whole encounter from a second angle, including Hart picking up the leather folder and tossing it aside, unopened. There was Susan Alvarez's video, and Andre Fisher's and his mother's. There was the computer log proving Hart had run the plate, received a result that matched everything Raymond had said, and made the deliberate choice to keep his prisoner in the cage anyway. 6 angles, 1 truth. An officer's defense in a case like this always rests on what he reasonably believed and reasonably feared. But the camera on Hart's own chest had recorded the truth being offered to him, out loud, over and over, and had recorded him physically refusing to look at it. There was no reasonable fear on that tape. There was only a man who had decided, before he ever stepped out of his cruiser, that a black man washing a car at a nice house had to be a criminal, and who had bent every fact that followed to fit that decision. And this time, the pattern did not stay buried. Because the incoming chief had already been reading the file, Internal Affairs pulled every prior complaint attached to Cody Hart's name, and investigators went looking for the people behind them. One of the first they contacted was a 17-year-old named Andre Fisher, who this time, with the chief of police personally assuring him it mattered, sat down and gave a full statement about the night Hart had emptied his pockets onto a cruiser hood for nothing. Others, seeing that the department was finally taking it seriously, came forward too. The single incident on Raymond's lawn had cracked open a pattern that stretched back years. The findings, when they came, were not survivable. Unlawful arrest, multiple failures to verify readily available identification, a false charge announced on camera, a documented pattern of bias stops. Officer Cody Hart was terminated from the department. At 30 years old, 4 years into the career he'd used to decide who did and didn't belong on his streets, he was out of it. And because the termination was for cause, exhaustively documented, and tied to a pattern, the chances of ever wearing a badge anywhere again were effectively gone. There was, of course, a civil rights claim. When a police officer falsely arrests a man on his own property and the entire thing is captured from 6 angles, the question is never whether the city pays, only how much. The settlement was substantial, a 6-figure acknowledgement that traced back to 5 seconds in a driveway when an officer chose not to look at a badge. Raymond did not pursue it for himself with any relish. A settlement simply moves public money from one account to another. What he cared about was the part money couldn't buy. It was all on the record now, permanent and undeniable, a case study his department would be trained on for years. When Hart reached out to the union that had always closed ranks around officers in trouble, the conversation was short. A representative watched the footage, all 6 angles of it, and told him, without much softness, that this was not a case anyone was going to fight to the wall. There are cases a union spends its capital on, and there are cases where the video is so clean that fighting only spreads the stain to everyone standing near it. Cuffing the incoming chief on the man's own lawn, on camera, with the officer's own name already sitting in the department's complaint file, was the second kind. For the first time in his career, Cody Hart was on his own. His last walk through the building was a quiet one. He set a cardboard box on his old desk in the bullpen and put a coffee mug and a couple of photographs into it. A room full of officers who had once traded jokes with him found things to look at on their monitors. Nobody offered a handshake, nobody said much of anything. He carried the box to the front, and at the desk he unclipped the heavy duty belt, surrendered his service weapon into evidence, and set his badge. The badge he'd used to decide who did and didn't belong on his streets. Flat on the counter. Without the belt and the shield, the swagger he'd carried into Raymond Dixon's driveway was simply gone. He pushed through the glass doors into the parking lot as a private citizen, and because the termination was for cause and thoroughly documented, that was the last badge Cody Hart would ever carry. Cody Hart had wanted, on a boring Saturday, to be the man who caught somebody. He had caught the one person in the entire city he could least afford to be wrong about, and it had cost him everything. But firing one officer was never going to be the point, and Raymond Dixon knew it. A single termination is a headline. It is not a change. If all he did was remove Cody Hart, then in a year there would be another Cody Hart and another driveway, and another folder tossed on another hood. Raymond had not taken this job to win one case. He had taken it to fix the machine that produced the case. So, in his first 90 days as chief, he went to work on the machine. He rewrote the department's stop and detain policy so that an officer who was shown valid identification was required to examine it, on camera, and to articulate, in the report, in writing, the specific facts that justified a detention beyond a person simply being somewhere. A hunch is not a fact, he told his commanders. He didn't look like he belonged is not a fact. If you can't write down what crime you reasonably suspect and why, you don't have a stop. You have a bias. He overhauled how complaints were handled. For years, complaints like Andre's had gone into a drawer to die because the people filing them were young or poor or black or simply not believed, and because no one whose career depended on it was ever watching. Raymond built a tracking system that flagged patterns, the same officer's names surfacing across multiple complaints, and put those patterns in front of human beings whose job was to act on them. The thing that had let Hart operate for years was not that no one had complained. It was that complaining had never mattered. Raymond made it matter, and he made the training personal. He did not lecture his officers about hypotheticals. He showed them the video, his video, with his permission, the footage of their own chief being cuffed on his own lawn, and he walked them through it frame by frame. Here is where he offered his ID. Here is where you would have run the plate. Here is the exact second where a reasonable officer stops, and where this officer chose to keep going, not a stranger in a case study. Their chief, on his own grass, in a soap-stained shirt. It landed the way no slogan ever could. Veteran officers who had heard 100 diversity seminars and rolled their eyes through all of them sat in silence watching the man who now signed their paychecks be treated like a criminal on his own property. And something got through that had never gotten through before. Not fear of him, though there was some of that. Recognition. The uncomfortable, necessary recognition of themselves and Cody Hart, and of how close every one of them had come on some slow shift to making the same choice. Not everyone loved it. Some grumbled that the new chief was soft, that he'd handcuffed the whole department over a personal grudge. Raymond heard the grumbling and was unbothered by it. He had not come to be loved. He had come to make sure that the promise pinned to every chest in that building actually meant something to the people on the other side of it. And slowly, stop by stop, report by report, the numbers began to move. Detentions that couldn't be justified in writing dropped. Complaints taken seriously dropped behind them. Trust, the slowest thing in the world to rebuild, just began to rebuild. A little over a year later, on a warm Saturday morning that looked almost exactly like the one that had started all of this, Raymond Dixon was once again in his driveway in Cedar Hollow, washing his car in an old t-shirt. This time, a patrol cruiser that slowed near his house did so because the young officer driving it raised a hand in an easy wave, the way you wave at the chief and at a neighbor, and drove on. Raymond waved back and kept rinsing the fender. The boxes were long unpacked. The house had become a home. And the man washing the car was, by every measure that showed up in the department's quarterly numbers, running a police force that looked meaningfully different than the one he had inherited. Andre Fisher still lived next door. He was 18 now, finishing his last year of high school, and over that year something had grown between the teenager and the chief who had knelt on his lawn and told him his fear mattered. Raymond had checked in on him. He'd written him a college recommendation, and one evening, over the fence, Andre had told him, a little sheepishly, that he'd been thinking about criminal justice as a major, not because of what the officer did to him, but because of what the chief did after. Because he'd seen, up close, that the thing wearing the badge could be the problem, or it could be the fix, and he thought maybe he wanted to be one of the people who made sure it was the fix. Raymond had told him the truth, that the department would be lucky to have him, and that it needed people who knew exactly what it felt like to be on the wrong end of a bad stop, because those were the people least likely to ever make one. As for Cody Hart, he was gone from law enforcement for good. A cautionary name in a training module, the officer in the video every new recruit in the city now watched during their first week. He had wanted to be remembered as the cop who protected Cedar Hollow. He was remembered instead as the lesson. And that's really the whole thing, isn't it? Not 1 second of what happened on that lawn had to happen. All Cody Hart had to do, at any of a dozen moments, was stop and actually look at the ID, at the folder, at the man, at the truth being offered to him plainly and patiently, instead of at the story he'd already written before he ever got out of the car. A soap-stained t-shirt instead of a suit. A face he didn't recognize instead of one he did. That was all the evidence he needed to put handcuffs on a man in his own driveway. And the only reason the world ever found out is that, by pure chance, he did it to the one man who could no longer let it disappear into a drawer. Which should make you wonder how many times it happened to someone who couldn't. So, let me ask you directly, because I read every comment. Have you ever been decided about, sized up and written off before you ever opened your mouth? And be honest, how often do we quietly do the same thing to someone else? Tell me about it below. That conversation is the whole reason a story like this matters. If this one moved you, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so the next story finds you. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.